let's talk about WP Rig. What is it and why have you created it?
WP Rig is a new development rig for developing progressive themes. So it's a build process and starter theme combined into one convenient package that you just put into your development environment, whatever it is, and it helps you write PHP, CSS, and JavaScript, and then compile it into an extremely progressive, forward-looking theme. It was built because I've been teaching people how to build themes for many years through first lynda.com and then LinkedIn Learning. And the #1 request I get back is, you can use a starter theme, and starter themes work fine, but if you want to extend them, you need to know, first of all, a lot about how WordPress works and how the template hierarchy works and everything else. And you also need to know how to build your own build process and use all these new technologies that everyone's using. And it becomes very complex because people just want to write PHP and CSS and JavaScript. They don't want to know what are the latest performance standards and go read all the blogs and do all this extra research. So I started working with Google on this project because we have a joint interest in improving the quality of the code on the web. So Google wants to dramatically improve the quality of code on the web quickly, and I've realized that WordPress is a good vehicle for that because WordPress is 30% of the web. So if the code quality of WordPress is better, 30% of the web becomes better as a result, right? Which benefits them. I want to use WordPress as a vehicle to further web standards. And I've been talking about this for years, that WordPress has such a huge footprint that if we do something, it just becomes the standard, right? The best example we currently have is responsive images. So if you look at statistics of web page load overall on the internet, you can actually see on the graph a drop when WordPress, I forget which version it was, but a version shipped that had responsive images, and then all of a sudden the average page size on the internet fell because of WordPress. And then you think, it's a major thing, but it's a relatively minor performance improvement. If we then implemented much stricter performance improvements on the web, all of a sudden we could actually significantly improve this. So what I've done is taken the concept of the starter theme, right? This boilerplate theme that has the general components you would use to build a theme, and said, what is it that people actually want? They want a starter theme that gives you some basic styling, so you're not starting from scratch completely, that gives you the most modern code possible. So, your menu is laid out using Flex, and your main layout is grid layout, and it has an accessible drop-down menu built in that works with mouse and keyboard and touch and everything else. And all these standard components are just there, so you don't have to build them. And then it gives you a build process that then optimizes all the code when you ship it, so that the end user who uses the theme doesn't have to, after the fact, install a minification plugin and a caching plugin and lazy loading images plugin and everything. So out of the box, WP Rig gives you minified JavaScript and CSS. It runs your JavaScript through Babel, so you can write modern JavaScript in ES 2015. It runs your CSS or Sass through CSS Next and Post CSS, so you can use custom properties or CSS variables and all this other fancy new CSS stuff that doesn't exist yet. You can write it now and it gets compiled into something workable. It takes all these other performance enhancements that exist that we normally don't use in WordPress because they are kind of tricky to wire up. They're already wired up, so you don't have to figure out how to do it. It's just there, so you can just hook into it, and everything gets packaged into this nice little theme that you can ship out of the box. So if you just install WP Rig and run it the way it is, you get this nice minimalist theme. If you spend an hour working with it, you can completely restyle it and make it into your own theme. And if you spend more time, you can extend it and add components to it and just make it into something new.
You just mentioned Google is a partner. You collaborated with Google in it, but the community was involved as well. You worked with Carrie Dills and some other people. Yeah.
So the WP Rig project is a true open source WordPress project, meaning it is not owned by a company. So I'm LinkedIn Learning, right? And LinkedIn Learning has fully committed to this to support WP Rig, both now at launch and in the future. And what we've done is we've said, LinkedIn Learning is donating my time to first build it and then maintain it. And we've also created courses to teach people how to use it that were released for free. So you don't have to have an account. You can just go watch it, and they will be free forever. In addition, we want it to be a thing that is owned by the community. So WP Rig lives under a GitHub organization account that isn't owned by us. Well, it's owned by me, right? But it's an organization account that isn't under a brand. So it's not a LinkedIn Learning thing or a Google thing or anything else. And everyone can contribute to it. So right now, I've contributed the majority of the code, but Google has helped me develop code. XWP has helped me develop some of the code. Other community members have helped develop it. I invited Rachel Cherry, who runs WP Campus and a bunch of other stuff, to be the co-maintainer. So the two of us are the ones that sit on top of the castle right now and make decisions. We're inviting in people to, well, anyone who wants to, but we've actively reached out to the accessibility group, to everyone else to get code contributions to make sure that this is the best practice. And moving forward, I want everyone to not just think of this as a thing I can download and use as a theme. I want people to think of this as a thing that they own. Meaning, you take it and you install WP Rig and you build your own themes with it. And then you figure out, oh, I can build this extension to it to do this fancy thing. And I think other people have use of this. Put it up as a pull request. And it'll probably get added in, right? So over time, it'll grow into more than just a development rig. It'll grow into this modular space where you as a developer can go in and say, in this theme, I'm going to need a slider. There's a slider component you can pull in. That's not a plugin, but it's like a finished component that you can just add in. Or in this theme, I need WooCommerce support. Well, if the WooCommerce team submits an extension, we will add it in. But they'll all be extensions that you can choose to plug into the theme as a developer. So it gives the developer full control over functionality, but availability of code, so they don't have to figure out how to do this every time. So once I come home from WordCamp Europe, one of the first things I'm doing is building a huge tutorial that showcases how to build a slider or a carousel component. Because one of the things that we've focused on a lot with WP Rig is make it work well with the AMP plugin. Some people will hear that and go, oh, so you are in Google's pocket. And my answer to that is actually not. It's just that the AMP plugin is something that will be used by a lot of people. And me as a theme developer, I cannot have an opinion about whether or not people should use the AMP plugin. That has to be the individual site owner's choice. What I want as a theme developer is control over what happens when the AMP plugin is activated, right? So in WP Rig, there's this function called WP Rig is AMP that allows you to test whether or not the AMP plugin is active. And then you can wrap your functionality in that conditional statement to either say, if the AMP plugin is active, do this. Or if the AMP plugin is not active, do this, right? So that once people click on it, you, the theme developer, can then make sure that they get the best experience possible. So the carousel is a good example. I personally think that image carousels, other than purely for images, is a terrible idea. And research shows that you shouldn't have them on your sites because people scroll past them. Ignore all that. Let's pretend it's something that people want. Because the reality is people will put them on their websites. Carousels and sliders are very challenging because they're hard to build. They're harder to make accessible. And one of the reasons why there's so much trouble with carousels is there are a million different versions of carousels out there. And they're all okay, and some of them are better than others, but they all have problems. And there's a ton of commercial products that try to solve it and everything. So every website you see with a carousel likely has a slightly different version of a carousel. And the accessibility community is like, oh my God, so we have to go and fix all of these, right? And then every time someone builds a theme, they'll go and grab a carousel and put it in, and then it'll change over time. And then in addition, you then have things like AMP that say, no, carousels are stupid. We're going to have our own carousel. Right? So the thinking behind this modularization that is in WP Rig is, what if we can have in WP Rig an extension called Carousel? All you need to do to get it to work is call it. You just say carousel here, and then you pass some value that says what images go into it, and then it appears. And then that module then has a fully accessible carousel marked up already. It has the styles necessary, it has the JavaScript necessary, and it's wrapped inside the test for AMP. And if the AMP plugin is activated, it brings in the AMP component instead. And it's modularized so that when you build a new theme, you just take the whole module and you just copy it over or activate it in that other theme, and it just kicks in and works without you having to then go and say, oh, how do I write this again? Which code did I copy from what website to make this work, right? Because then I can get the accessibility team to just commit the time to that one component. And that will then become the component. So when you see a carousel on a WordPress site, it'll be that one. It can look different for every single one of them because you can change it with styles and you can change its behavior and everything. But you know that the code is consistent, that it's accessible, that it works, and that it falls back if someone uses the AMP plugin, right? And that's the idea, to give the community this tool that helps us make consistently better code without having to do a ton of extra work.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, just because there's a million features, on top of that, out of the box, WP Rig tests your code against the WordPress coding standards.
Okay.
It lints both your PHP and CSS against WordPress coding standards. It lints your CSS against ESLint and WordPress coding standards, both in your editor, in the build process, and if you hook it up in Travis on GitHub. And all of this comes in the kit.
Oh.
So it really tries to enforce code quality. And it means that you as a developer don't need to figure out how to hook it up. It's hooked up already. You just run it, add the right extensions to your editor. You do that once, make one definition call to tell the editor where the files sit, and then it just all kicks in and works.
So how does the project fit in with your work on ethical web design?
One of the challenges that we have as a community, the web community, is that we've built basically a social experiment. It wasn't meant to be, but it is. That is altering human beings and guiding behavior in a very odd way, right? So when we make decisions about our designs and how we build things, they're actually decisions made on behalf of our end users. So every design decision, whether that's a decision about the color you're using, or where you place a button, or how you structure your database, or what kind of module you use to do something, they're all decisions made on behalf of the people at the end of that chain, right? And when you think specifically about performance and accessibility, what you're looking at is how do we give the end user the capability to use the website at all? Right? So the accessibility conversation, which has been going on for a long time, is always around like, should I spend the extra time to make blind people be able to get access to this content, right? Yeah. But that's not what accessibility is all about. The accessibility principle is you publish information online. Anyone should be able to access that information in whatever way they want to, right? The web is text-based. So all that styling and stuff you put on it is just visual. You should be able to grab the text and get it so that you can consume it in whatever way you think is useful, whether that be looking at it on a screen the way it wasn't designed, take the text out and just have the text, have the computer read it back to you, convert it to Braille, whatever, right? And then because we also have an international community, it should also be possible to take the text and convert it into another language. Right? And that means it needs to be marked up properly, it needs to have the right tags on them, right? And you're like, where the hell is this going with WP Rig? So, that's the accessibility part. The performance part looks like an issue of, I want things to load fast, because I live in North America, and when I go into a tunnel and the internet doesn't work, I get annoyed. That's not what it's about. Accessibility is about, you go to northern Canada, where they have garbage internet, just because someone has to beam the internet across enormous distances just to get there. Or you go to like in a valley in Norway, like inside a deep valley in Norway, where there just isn't proper internet. Or you go to Africa, where the entire village the internet runs off a single cell phone that then distributes the network out. Or you go to, you know, a country that is in some sort of humanitarian crisis where the internet is basically broken down and people need information. Those are the people who need access to content. They need accessible content and they need performant content. Content that doesn't try to download every image on a page when you only need the stuff that's on the top. Content that doesn't waste resources downloading style sheets that you're not going to use, right? They just need the information. And this whole performance conversation is about that. Giving people enough data to get access to the content, but don't waste a single bit of information that shouldn't be there, right? So instead of serving up this monolithic style sheet that has every possible style for every possible scenario, we should give you only the styles you need. And then if you need more, we'll just add them in as you get access to them. Same with the images, same with the JavaScript, same with everything. Don't waste the energy of the end user until it's necessary.
Can you quickly talk us through the framework again that you mentioned in your talk yesterday, like the 4 questions that designers should ask themselves when they will decide to make sure it's ethical web design?
I talk about ethics a lot online, and it's kind of funny because I will often say things like, here's a good example of why we need ethics in tech. And then someone will say, what do you mean? I'm ethical. And then I go, oh, okay, so I need to change how I talk about this because they're misunderstanding, like they think I'm passing a moral judgment on them as people.
Right. Okay.
Right? So when I say we need to have ethics in tech, I don't mean you're a bad person. That's a moral judgment, right? What I mean is we don't have the tools to evaluate our decisions properly to make sure that we're making good decisions. So what ethics is a methodology for saying, is this decision good or bad? Does it do good or does it do bad things? Is it a right decision or a wrong decision, right? And there are many different ethical or moral philosophies, and they all kind of compete with each other on being the one moral philosophy. And I studied philosophy in university, and it was frustrating to study philosophy because you would like spend a couple of weeks on each moral philosophy and you'd be like, you know, this is the be all and end all of ethics, but it has all these issues. And it solves 80% of the problems, but then introduces 20% of new problems. And then you move on to the next one and you go, this one solves all problems except 20% of new problems. And then the next one does the same thing. And as a philosopher, you go, this is great because it makes this interesting discussion and everything. But then at the same time, you're like, this is awful because you go into the world and you give people this and they're all going to be like, what the hell is this? You give me this impossible framework and you say that one of these is the right way to go. So what I'm proposing is we take the 4 main moral philosophies. They are consequentialism, duty ethics, virtue ethics, and a new thing called capability approach. Then we take the best parts of each of them and string them together and say our process includes having to pass a test for each. So to make a decision, you have to say, I have tested it against these 4 moral philosophies, and I'm certain that this is a good decision. And then you're like, oh, so now I just need to read everything there is to ever written about ethics? Great, thanks, that will really help me, right? So I've condensed them into 4 questions. Yeah. So if we go from a new decision, so you want to make something new, you start by asking why. Why am I making this? And the answer is not to make money. What I mean by why is, what are you building, like what kind of future are you building by doing this? Because anytime you make a decision, what you're trying to do is make a change in the world, right? That change may be to get people to sign up to a newsletter, but you're trying to get them to sign up to a newsletter for a reason, right? You want them to change the person at the end of that newsletter to give them information, to get them to do something, right? So then you say, why am I doing this? As in, what kind of capability am I granting or enabling the person at the other end of this conversation? So when you think through that and you actually realize that this decision changes another person's world and makes a future for that person, and you're comfortable with the future you're guiding that person into, you move to the next step and you say, who do I become by doing this? What kind of standard am I setting for myself what type of person do I turn into by making this decision? And once you're happy with the kind of person you are, that you can say, when I come back to this 10 years from now, I will look back on this decision and be like, this is the right thing. I can see how this led me to where I am today, and this is where I wanted to be. Then you move on to the next step and you say, what are my duties of care? Who am I responsible for, and how do I take responsibility for the outcomes that are happening here? Right? You look at, I have responsibilities to my client, to the end user, to the world that end user lives in, to everyone they interact with, and myself. And if I can justify this decision to all of those responsibilities, then you move on to the final step and say, what are the consequences of doing this? Not just the immediate consequence of getting people to do what you want, but what are the long-term consequences? And what are the secondary consequences that come from that? And if you build these questions into your design process, you'll discover that each of these questions allows you to explore what you're trying to do in a whole new way. It opens the door to all these new possibilities, and it really makes you think carefully about what you're doing. So it's not a moralistic blanket that quenches the fires of creativity. It's actually more like a hearth that controls your creative flames and makes sure you don't burn down the house. Right?
One more question to bring back to WordPress. Where do you see the future of WordPress, and why do you think it would be irresponsible to have an aim that WordPress reaches 50% of the web, which I think I saw in one of
read my tweets. I'll answer the last question first. So
yeah.
I think there's a real danger in any kind of monopoly. Any kind of monoculture is dangerous, right? 30% is a very high number, because that means any change we make to WordPress, like, you know, some trivial thing like changing the entire editor, something like that, impacts millions of people. And millions of people have basically no say in that decision. It's a decision made on behalf of millions of people. Right? So as WordPress grows, our influence, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and we end up actually building the future of all the people who interact with us. Not just the people who use WordPress, but the people who interact with the websites they build. So with WordPress's growth comes WordPress's responsibility, and at some point we are actually the ones that define how the world works, right? In a very real sense. So growing too big becomes dangerous because it gives us too much control.
Yeah.
Right? And it's weird because you're like, but I want control. You don't want control because you don't want to create a world where you're the only one that makes decisions. You want to have a pluralistic world where there are alternatives. So I think the WordPress project should actively support competitors. Like when Matt Mullenweg starts talking about going to conferences and talking to conferences with competitive software like Drupal, that's a good thing. We should send people there. Drupal people here talking at this WordCamp, that's a great thing. Because we need to grow the ecosystem, right? What we are is part of the open web ecosystem. What WordPress now, with its foothold, needs to focus on is growing the open web ecosystem and be part of it. It can be a guiding part of it and a leading part of it, but it cannot eat the whole thing, right? The second we own the ecosystem and other things go away, we have too much control. Now, the first part of the question was like, where do you see WordPress headed, right? I think 5 years from now, the web as a whole will be fundamentally different from what we have today. Last year I talked about how Gutenberg needs to be ready for VR, and people are like, what were you drinking before you came here? Like that's nuts. It's not. It's not crazy at all. All these big tech companies are very aggressively working on trying to figure out how to put content here, either as an augmented level to reality or as an actual replacement for reality, right? That is technology that will change a lot in the next couple of years. And the path that we're heading down is basically a path that says the idea of content being consumed on screens that are contained like this is going away. Everything we are currently doing assumes the content is consumed on a screen that is rectangular and is held. So 5 years from now, unless we evolve to allow for content to be consumed with other means, we'll just outdate ourselves and go away, right? And Gutenberg is one of the things that has the potential of building a path into that future, to say that by breaking apart content, we're preparing for a situation where people might want to pull content and consume it in the way they want to. I mean, I consume almost all of the internet through my e-reader. I have severe dyslexia, so I have a really hard time reading content on the web, right? So what I do is I use Pocket, the application. Okay. So anytime I see something online, I want to read this, I tag it on Pocket. And then I have a Kobo e-reader, and the Kobo e-reader syncs to my Pocket account. Okay. And then I open the article in Pocket, and then it's formatted with the font I want, font size I want. It has like lookup text for definitions and everything in many different languages. So I consume your article on your website that you spent weeks designing on my e-reader, never seeing your ads, never seeing your designs, never seeing your font choices, never seeing any of that, just seeing the text, right? That's how people are going to consume WordPress content in the future. Probably not even on a reader. They'll have an AI thing read it back to them. And they'll even talk to it and say things like, can you just skip past all the crap? I only want the details, right? Can you like take this 9,000 word article and condense it into 2 minutes? And then some machine somewhere on the internet will do that. And our content, the way the framework we are building with WordPress needs to prepare for that reality and prepare the community for that reality, that there's a time when being a WordPress designer means designing the content to be accessible to people rather than make sure the borders have 2-pixel margins, right?
Great. That's great. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Cheers.